Hi everyone, this is Tori Vandelin with Prevent Connect. Thanks for joining us on our third part of our conversation with Dr. Meghna Bhatt. Dr. Meghna Bhatt is an outspoken advocate against gender violence and injustice. She is passionate about using film and cinema and storytelling as a tool to create social change and community dialogue, gender violence prevention education and outreach, cultural competency, street harassment, and racial, social, and immigrant justice. On this podcast, Meghna shares more with us about her experiences in engaging in violence prevention work in India and with South Asian communities in the United States.
So Meghna, I know, you shared that you've been in the US for 15 years now. When you were in India, were you working around violence prevention in your community, or has that work mostly happened since you've been in the US?
Yeah, I think it's been mostly. I think when I was pursuing my bachelor's in psychology, I came across a lot of information. But I think in terms of implementing it or kind of using it in my study or going ahead to figure out a prevention perspective or knowledge, I got that opportunity only when I came to the US.
Mm.
So I think it's also about, kind of having those privileged spaces to kind of, use your experiences and the knowledge that I'd gained to kind of talk about it and kind of learn about prevention much more and apply it in different ways. And that's where my dissertation came into the picture too, is how much my lived experiences and professional education and professional work kind of influenced my dissertation and my research or my prevention work right now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So Meghna, we know that you are a South Asian woman, and you've also had connections in Illinois to organizations that do culturally specific prevention work. So I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit more about prevention in the South Asian context, both there and here in the U.S.
Sure. Thanks, Tori. I think for me, I think eventually in my prevention work, when I realized was, I think we all discuss and agree is prevention is more than tabling and creating awareness, right? And I mean, I acknowledge that there are organizations and communities that are short-staffed and under-resourced. That's a different story. It's a first step to going towards prevention. But I think in terms of South Asian communities and my work that my experience of connecting with South Asian organizations in Chicago or even learning about prevention work in India, I've been really fortunate to come across this, amazing work being done in whatever capacity they could, in whatever limitations they had. I've had opportunity to kind of volunteer for, a multicultural, multilingual, DV agency, where they kind of started having these roundtable discussions with, by engaging young men and women in South Asian communities. I feel I've had the fortunate to come across different South Asian-based organizations, but they're usually multicultural, multilingual, DV or SV agencies. And they have been, culturally responsive in terms of acknowledging what the specific risk factors and the, protective factors are. One of the examples is kind of having these community dialogues by engaging young boys and men in about what is masculinity, right? And I know we see these different discussions, but they also try to make sustain it by having these conversations, not just once and then you forget about it, right? Yeah. It's more about okay, what action can you take from there to your own communities, and how can you create that ripple effect about prevention. So I feel the first step for even just to have these young boys and men in a room and to kind of facilitate that dialogue, sometimes I feel it can be a huge milestone to kind of break the barriers, because a lot of communities, I think, depending on, I will talk in general about the South Asian context, even though, I'm from India and that's my expertise. But I feel sometimes, there's this whole culture of silence and, the whole stigma talking, whether it's about, disclosures about sexual violence or, any scene that comes up in films, for example, any of those conversations, right? Or someone, if they come to know that there has been, child abuse in the family. So all these factors, in addition to generational difference of opinions, right? I think that creates a huge barrier to even reach out to them. a lot of them are in denial, where a lot of community members, especially from the older generation, are likely to say, no, this doesn't happen in our family, and we see that elsewhere too. So I feel like they have prevention programs like kind of build on the model of engaging boys and men, which is an important step because a lot of the specifically the gender violence, whether it's in India or South Asian diaspora, things that I have learned in my research is like many of the men kind of claim the report is like what motivated them to kind of rape or sexually assault someone is also about their belief that they have a right to the women's body, like without their consent kind of thing.
Yeah.
So I'm just like, this is just one example, one out of the million studies that have been done, but this is kind of a constant theme that keeps coming up. There are organizations that are catering to Muslim communities, and I feel like that's a huge step again towards prevention, where they are actually including young teenagers and youth, both of different genders, across all genders, to kind of engage in these conversations and providing leadership roles. So it's mainly like youth-led advocacy and conversations, whether it's about healthy relationships, about what does consent look like, what is about setting boundaries, how to talk to someone who discloses to you, So there are these different aspects, not just about prevention, but response and other forms too. And to have that is like groundbreaking. Because again, Muslim communities can be negatively stereotyped very often by the mainstream, movement, right? By the mainstream organizations. So I feel for someone to even come up with those conversations is a huge, and I know I'm like, it's a huge success, I feel, to kind of break the barriers.
Yeah.
One campaign that comes up in India, which I found it very, very interesting and fascinating. They came out with these PSA commercials, and where basically, if you hear, your neighbor having some form of spousal abuse, and like for example, in this situation, like the woman is being screaming, and you can hear battering. As a neighbor, as a kind of potential bystander, you can actually go and kind of distract the situation by letting them know that someone is we know that there's spousal abuse that's going on, and that's not right. Right? I mean, it's just like a small step, but the campaign was called Bell Bajao, which means ring the doorbell.
Oh.
And there are these different situations they gave where, as a neighbor, they would go and ring the doorbell and would just like ask a question like, oh, do you have any sugar that, I'm out of sugar? Or, do you know, like something like, do you want this, sales thing or whatever it is, do you want, I'm selling these, do you want this? Like any kind of conversation that kind of is a form of intervention. And it's a similar thing to bystander intervention, but as a neighbor, how can you be accountable, as a community to kind of intervene and prevent it from happening?
Were those on like the television or?
Yeah.
Okay.
It was on television as far as I remember. It was on YouTube. So it was available on YouTube. And that became like a huge thing about, how we can hold communities accountable. Because I feel that's a very critical step for preventing, right? Prevention. And one last thing I wanted to just highlight was, there are many other examples, but in India, the National Center for Research on Women, I think they had either released a report or, worked with some other local organizations in Mumbai, where they kind of incorporated and adapted the coaching boys into men model.
Oh, wow.
And and I can share the link, but it's more like where they actually trained coaches and athletes, especially coaches, cricket, for the cricket game, which is like a crazy national, fanatic thing to watch, and people love watching it. It becomes, again, that's another, important part of our upbringing. So I feel like to kind of train these athletes and train these coaches, to kind of engage their students, young boys who are wanting, to becoming cricketers, to kind of engaging them in having these conversations. Again, revolving around healthy masculinities, about gender equality, about promoting respect, and what kind of more like conflict resolution, right? It's not about using aggression and not violence as conflict resolution, as a technique of conflict resolution. And I felt that was, again, I mean, I have to mention that Mumbai is again a very privileged space, being cosmopolitan and being more urban. And I'm pretty sure there are other programs that are doing it more, in rural areas across all demographics, which is again an integral part of the primary prevention efforts.
Yeah, those are really cool examples. Thank you for sharing those. We'll have to be sure to link so folks can get more information if they're interested.
Thanks for listening. Tune in to our 4th podcast with Meghna, where we talk about street harassment and her work with the organization Stop Street Harassment.